Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
When I was probably around 6 years old, my parents, my brother, and I were living in an apartment. Most of my memories from that age are pretty ordinary. School, cartoons, toys, fighting with my brother over stupid things, waiting for my parents to come home, stuff like that. But there is one Halloween night I still remember, because two strange things happened within the same day. And nobody in my family really believes the story the way I remember it. The first part happened earlier in the evening. It was Halloween, so kids were coming around the apartment building trick-or-treating. There was nothing unusual about that. People were wearing costumes, knocking on doors, getting candy, moving on to the next apartment. At some point, 3 kids came to our door. I remember thinking their costumes were pretty basic, nothing impressive. They looked like they had thrown something together because they wanted the candy more than they cared about dressing up. That was normal, too. I was 6. I was not judging costume design professionally. I just remember thinking they were kind of boring. One of the boys looked familiar to me. He reminded me of one of my relatives. At that age, I was probably not very good at recognizing people from partial features, especially when they were wearing costumes. Maybe he had similar hair, similar height, similar face shape. Whatever it was, my brain immediately decided I knew him. So I called him by my relative's name. For a second, the kid looked confused. That part has always stayed with me. He did not immediately respond like someone who had been recognized. There was a pause, like he was trying to figure out what I meant. Then he changed his reaction. He basically agreed. Yeah, it was him. He started acting like he knew me. At 6 years old, I accepted that for at least a moment. I had already given him the answer. I had told him who I thought he was. All he had to do was say yes. Then he asked whether my parents were home. That question did not immediately set off alarms for me. I was a little kid. Adults teach children not to talk to strangers, but when you believe someone is a relative, they stop feeling like a stranger. I told them the truth. My parents were not home. It was just me and my brother. My parents had gone to my grandmother's place. It was only about a 10-minute trip, so they were not going to be away for long. But in that moment, 3 kids standing outside our door now knew 2 children were alone inside the apartment. Then they asked if they could come in. I said no. I do not remember exactly why I refused. Maybe I knew we were not supposed to let people inside while our parents were gone. Maybe something about them had already begun feeling wrong. Maybe my brother and I had been told very clearly not to open the door for anybody. Whatever the reason, I did not invite them inside. That should have ended it. Instead, they became pushy. They started trying to convince me. Come on, we're family. Things like that. The kid I had mistakenly identified kept using the fact that I had called him a relative. He was basically playing along with the mistake now. I had given him a reason he could use to get through the door. That is the part that seems much more disturbing to me as an adult than it did as a child. A normal kid who gets mistaken for someone else would probably laugh and say, "I'm not him." Maybe they would think it was funny. What I remember is this kid realizing I thought I knew him, and then using it. He asked if my parents were home. Then he wanted to come inside. I still said no. At some point, my brother heard the conversation. He yelled from somewhere inside the apartment, asking who was at the door. I called back that it was our relative, and when I said that, the kids looked at me. Then they left. They did not keep arguing. They did not try to force the door. They just took off. At the time, I was probably only confused, maybe even annoyed. I thought my relative had shown up with some friends, acted strangely, and then left. Eventually, I learned that the kid had not been my relative at all. I had misidentified him, and that changed the entire memory. Because then, the sequence became much harder to dismiss. 3 kids came to our door. One looked vaguely familiar. I accidentally told him who I thought he was. He went along with it. Then he asked whether our parents were home. When I said no, he and his friends tried to get inside. That is not paranormal. If my memory is accurate, it is just creepy human behavior. And honestly, that is probably the most serious part of this entire story. I do not know how old those kids were. In my memory, they were older than me, but when you are 6, almost everybody looks older. Maybe they were 9 or 10, maybe 12, maybe teenagers. I cannot say for sure. If they were young themselves, maybe they were just messing around. Kids can be stupid. They hear that someone's parents are gone and think it would be funny to scare the younger kid. Maybe they wanted to steal candy. Maybe they wanted to come inside and mess with us. Maybe it was nothing more serious than a prank. But I still do not like the way the conversation happened, especially the question about our parents. Maybe that detail has become sharper over time because I understand its significance now. Childhood memories can do that. Something you barely understood at 6 becomes much darker when you replay it as an adult. Maybe the original question was innocent. Are your parents giving out candy? Is anyone home? Something like that. And over the years, my memory compressed it into, are your parents home? That is possible. I cannot pretend a memory from age 6 is a perfect recording, but the basic feeling of that interaction has stayed with me. I thought I recognized someone. He realized I was mistaken, and instead of correcting me, he acted like I was right. That is the part I trust most. I also remember refusing to let them inside. Looking back, I am glad I did. Even if they were just kids trying to joke around, there was no reason to invite 3 people I did not actually know into the apartment while my parents were away. Eventually, my parents came back. I do not remember whether I immediately told them everything. Maybe I did. Maybe the whole thing seemed unimportant at the time. Halloween was busy. People came and went. I had probably already moved on to candy and whatever else 6-year-old me cared about. If that had been the only strange thing that happened, maybe I would not remember the night nearly as clearly. But later, sometime around 1 in the morning, something else happened. I woke up. I do not remember why. Maybe I needed the bathroom. Maybe there was a noise. Maybe I simply woke between dreams. The apartment was dark and quiet. Halloween was basically over. Most of the trick-or-treating had ended hours earlier. I looked out the window, and I saw something moving through the sky. I remember it as something flying, not an airplane, not a helicopter, not a bird. My memory is that it looked like a witch. I know how ridiculous that sounds, especially on Halloween. A 6-year-old wakes up around 1 in the morning on Halloween, looks out the window and sees a witch flying through the sky. That is almost too perfect. If someone else told me that story, I would immediately assume they were dreaming. And honestly, that is probably the most likely explanation. I had been asleep. I was very young. It was Halloween. My brain had spent the evening surrounded by costumes, decorations, candy, witches, ghosts, monsters, and everything else associated with the holiday. Then I woke in the middle of the night and saw a dark shape outside. It would not take much for a sleepy 6-year-old brain to turn that shape into a witch. Maybe it was a bird. A large bird flying close to the building could have created a strange silhouette. Maybe it was plastic or fabric caught in the wind. A Halloween decoration could have come loose from a balcony or roof. Maybe it was a balloon. Maybe something was being carried by wind at an unusual angle. At night, you lose most information about size and distance. A small object nearby can look enormous and far away. A large object far away can look tiny. Without reference points, the brain guesses. Maybe I saw an airplane from an odd angle. If the navigation lights were blocked, or if I only looked for a few seconds, I might not have recognized it. Maybe clouds or the window distorted the shape. Maybe it was nothing outside at all. A reflection in the glass could have appeared to be moving across the sky. Something inside the room. A shadow. A decoration. A person walking past behind me. Reflections at night are incredibly easy to misinterpret because windows become partly mirrors. If the apartment was darker in some places and there were streetlights outside, layers of reflections could overlap. A shape moving inside could seem to float outside. At 6, I would not know enough about reflections to question it. I would just see something in the sky. And because it was Halloween, my brain would give it the most obvious identity available. Witch. There's also the possibility that I was still partly dreaming. That explanation fits very well. People can wake up with dream imagery continuing for several seconds. The room looks real. The window is real. The outside world is real. But the brain adds one impossible image. A person, an animal, a figure in the sky. Then it fades. A child may not recognize the difference between that experience and ordinary waking perception. If I had been dreaming about Halloween and opened my eyes before the dream fully ended, I could have looked outside and literally seen a witch for a few seconds. Not because anything was there. Because part of the dream came with me. That would also explain why I do not remember a long sequence. I do not remember watching the figure for 5 minutes. I do not remember waking my parents and showing them. I do not remember following it from window to window. I have one image. Something flying. Something my mind remembers as a witch. That kind of brief fragment is exactly what you would expect from a half-awake childhood experience. What made the whole night stick, though, was the first event. Because that part involved my brother, too. He remembers at least some of it. Not perfectly. Not enough to confirm every detail. But he remembers something about those kids at the door. That matters to me because it gives the first half of the night a second witness. He cannot confirm the flying thing. That was mine alone. But the trick-or-treaters were not something I invented in a dream. There really were people at the door. There really was some interaction. My brother remembers at least enough to say the memory is not completely imaginary. Still, his partial memory does not prove the stranger intentionally tried to trick his way inside. He was inside the apartment and only heard part of what was happening. Most of the conversation happened between me and the kids. So again, I am left with my childhood memory. I have thought about whether the two events should even be connected. Probably not. There is nothing linking them except that they happened on Halloween. 3 strange kids at the door in the evening. A flying shape hours later. My child brain may have placed them into one story because Halloween already made everything feel connected. As an adult, I think they are probably 2 completely separate events. The first may have been real and potentially unsafe. The second was probably a dream, visual mistake, or ordinary object in the sky. Putting them together makes the night sound supernatural. Separating them makes it much more believable. And maybe that is closer to what actually happened. The kids at the door bother me more now because there is a grounded danger there. Suppose my memory is accurate. The kid heard me call him by a relative's name. He paused, then said yes. That means he knowingly pretended to be someone he was not. Then he asked if adults were home. Then he tried to get inside. That is enough to make me uncomfortable without adding anything else. Maybe they wanted to steal something. Maybe they wanted to scare us. Maybe they thought it would be funny to come in and take candy. Maybe they were older kids taking advantage of a younger child. Maybe there was no serious intention at all. I cannot know. But I do know that I was 6 and told strangers I was home without my parents. That is exactly the kind of situation adults warn kids about. If my brother had not called out, maybe they would have kept pushing. Maybe not. When he asked who was there and I loudly announced that they were relatives, perhaps they realized the lie had become harder to maintain. My brother might know what the actual relative looked like. He might come to the door. He might expose them immediately. That could explain why they left. Or maybe they were simply done with the joke. There is no way to recover their intentions now. The flying figure is almost the opposite kind of mystery. There is no human behavior to analyze, no conversation, no second witness. Just one young child looking through a window after waking. That gives sleep and perception enormous room to explain it. Even the date matters. Halloween imagery is everywhere when you are a child. Witches are one of the most recognizable shapes. Pointed hat, dark clothing. Broom, sometimes you do not need all those details. One crooked silhouette crossing the sky is enough. Maybe what I remember as a witch did not look anything like one objectively. Maybe there was just a dark shape. Years of retelling added the identity. I saw something flying. It looked like a person. Then, it looked like a witch. Childhood memories often become more organized as we get older. The central feeling stays, while the shape becomes easier to describe. That could have happened here. The timing around 1 in the morning could be approximate too. At 6, I probably was not carefully checking a clock and recording the exact time. Maybe I woke earlier. Maybe later. Maybe the memory of around 1 came from something I was told afterward. Again, none of that means I am making it up. It just means childhood memories have limits. The biggest clue to me is that I did not seem to stay terrified afterward. If I genuinely believed a supernatural witch was flying outside our apartment, I would expect a bigger reaction. Maybe I did react and forgot. But there is no strong memory of waking everyone up or refusing to go near the window. That makes a short waking dream feel especially plausible. I may have looked, seen it, registered witch, then fallen asleep again. The next morning, it became part of the strange Halloween night. The fact that nobody believed me probably made the memory stronger. When people dismiss something you feel certain happened, you replay it. You defend it internally. I know what I saw. I know what happened. That repetition preserves the memory. But it can also freeze an interpretation that might have changed if someone had investigated at the time. If my parent had looked outside and said, "That's a plastic witch decoration hanging from the building across the street," the mystery would have disappeared. If my brother had recognized the trick-or-treaters as kids from school, maybe that part would have had an explanation too. Instead, nothing was resolved. The night stayed strange. I think that is why I still remember it. Not because I believe Halloween somehow caused supernatural activity. I do not have evidence for that. The date probably influenced how I interpreted the second event much more than anything else. Halloween gives normal things horror imagery. A kid in a costume looks more suspicious. A shadow becomes a witch. A strange sound becomes a ghost. And because everyone expects scary things that night, coincidence feels meaningful. But the first event does not need Halloween to be unsettling. 3 kids at a door. A small child misidentifies one. The stranger accepts the false identity, then asks whether the parents are home. That would bother me on any date. If anything, Halloween gave them a perfect excuse to approach the door without seeming suspicious. People are expected to knock. Faces are partly covered. Strangers are everywhere. Kids are moving through apartment buildings. Doors are opening all night. That makes it an ideal situation for harmless pranks. It also means children should be more careful, because identifying people becomes harder. My mistake makes sense in that context. The kid probably did resemble my relative enough under a costume that I filled in the rest. At 6, facial recognition is not perfect. Add low light, excitement, costumes, and expectation, and mistakes are easy. What is harder to explain is why he played along. Maybe I remember that wrong. Maybe he said something sarcastic, like, "Yeah, sure, I'm him," and I took it literally. Maybe he thought I was joking. Maybe the whole conversation was more playful than threatening. That is possible. Tone is one of the first things memory loses. I remember the words and the feeling more than the exact way they were said. Adult me may hear manipulation, where child me heard normal joking. I try to leave room for that. My brother remembering only part of it also makes me careful. Shared memories can influence each other. Over the years, if I told him the story enough times, he might remember the version I told rather than his original experience. That happens to everyone. So I do not use his memory as perfect confirmation, only as a reason to think the door incident really happened in some form. The witch was different. That one remains completely mine. And honestly, I think there is a good chance my 6-year-old brain created it. Maybe I saw a bird. Maybe a decoration. Maybe a reflection. Maybe I was dreaming. All of those explanations are more believable than an actual witch flying over an apartment building. But the memory still feels strange, because I can picture looking through the glass and seeing that shape crossing the night sky. Sometimes childhood fear does not disappear when you find a reasonable explanation. It just changes category. Instead of "I saw a witch," it becomes "I saw something and interpreted it as a witch." That is still a real experience, just not necessarily a supernatural one. The part I would tell a child differently now is the door. If I could go back and talk to 6-year-old me, I would not focus on the flying thing. I would say never tell people at the door that you are alone, even if you think you recognize them, especially if they are wearing costumes. Close the door. Call your parents. Do not let anyone use familiarity to pressure you inside. That lesson seems much more important than whether the shape in the sky was real. In a weird way, the night contained 2 different kinds of childhood fear. One was a danger I did not fully understand at the time, people pretending to be familiar. The other was a danger I understood too much through imagination. A witch in the sky. Now I would probably reverse them. The witch was likely harmless perception. The kids at the door are what I would take seriously. Nothing bad happened. That is important too. They left. Nobody forced their way inside. My parents returned. My brother and I were fine. No one came back later. The flying figure disappeared. There was no second sighting. The apartment did not become haunted. Halloween ended. Life continued. But because nobody ever gave me a clear explanation for either thing, that night stayed in my memory much longer than hundreds of normal nights around it. I still picture the kid's confused expression when I called him by my relative's name. That brief pause. Then, him deciding to go with it. I still remember saying, My parents were gone. I still remember refusing to let them in, even when they became pushy. And I remember my brother yelling from inside, asking who was at the door. I answered that it was family. Then the three kids looked at me and left. Hours later, I woke in the dark, looked outside, saw something crossing the sky that 6-year-old me immediately understood as a witch. Maybe Halloween simply did what Halloween does best. It took two ordinary but strange events and tied them together in my memory until the entire night felt impossible. Maybe the kids were only messing with me. Maybe the thing outside was only a bird, a decoration, or the last piece of a dream. Those explanations are reasonable, probably correct. But there is still something I find unsettling about the first part. I accidentally gave a stranger the name of someone I trusted. He accepted it. Then, almost immediately, he wanted to know whether the adults were home. I said no. He asked to come inside. And the only thing 6-year-old me did completely right that night was keep saying no. One night, I was home alone in my room. Nothing felt strange at first. I had been using my computer earlier, probably playing something, and after I was done, I got up from the desk and lay down on my bed. Because I had pushed away from the computer, the chair was no longer tucked underneath the desk. It was sitting near the edge of my bed. I remember that position because of what happened next. I left some lo-fi music playing on the computer while I relaxed. The room was quiet, apart from the music. I was comfortable. I was not thinking about ghosts, intruders, or anything else unusual. Then, a notification appeared on the computer screen. At almost the same moment, the chair moved. It did not just shift slightly. From where I was lying, it looked like the chair moved from beside the bed back toward the desk, almost as though somebody had pushed it neatly underneath. I froze. For a second, I did not understand what I had just seen. My first instinct was to look around the room. Nobody was there. I was alone in the house. There was no person behind the chair. Nothing obvious had fallen against it. I had not touched it with my foot. At least, I did not think I had. The chair was simply in a different position. That was enough for me. I got out of the room almost immediately. I did not stay around trying to recreate it. I did not crawl underneath the desk checking the wheels. I panicked. Within seconds, I was somewhere else in the house calling my mom. I told her what happened. A chair had moved on its own. I had watched it happen. She did not believe me. To her, there were probably several easier explanations. Maybe I had accidentally moved it. Maybe it rolled. Maybe I remembered its starting position wrong. Maybe I was tired. She was not there, so all she had was my description. When she eventually came home, I tried to show her. I put the chair roughly where it had been. I explained that I had been lying on the bed. I showed her where the computer was. I reenacted the whole thing as closely as I could. She still did not believe anything supernatural had happened. And honestly, after a few days, even I started letting it go. Nothing else happened. The chair stayed where I put it. No doors opened. No strange voices. No footsteps. Life became normal again. I could go back into my room without thinking about it constantly. After enough ordinary days, the events started feeling more like one strange moment than the beginning of anything. I almost forgot about it. Then, 3 days ago, something happened again. This time, I was alone in the living room. I was watching YouTube on my phone. It was another completely normal situation. Our house has a small corridor connecting the 2 bedrooms and the bathroom. From the living room, you can see into that corridor. So if someone walks between those rooms, you can usually notice movement. While I was sitting there, I started hearing footsteps. At first, I probably assumed they were coming from somewhere ordinary. A neighbor, something outside, maybe the house itself making noises. But the more I listened, the more they seemed to be coming from the corridor. That made no sense. I was home alone. I looked toward the hallway. Nobody was there. I kept listening. Footsteps, at least, that was what they sounded like. I got up. At that point, I was thinking less about ghosts and more about whether somebody could actually be inside the house. That is a much more serious possibility. I checked the bedrooms. I looked at the windows. They were locked. I could not see any sign that someone had forced their way inside. Nothing looked broken. Nothing was open. There was no obvious place where an intruder could have entered. That should have made me feel safer. It did not. If anything, it made the footsteps harder to explain. I returned to the living room. Then I looked toward the corridor again. And that was when I saw her. Or what looked like her. A dark silhouette shaped like a woman. She seemed to be standing in the corridor. And in one hand, she appeared to be holding something sharp. My first thought was a knife. I did not see enough detail to say it definitely was one. It was only a shape. But in that moment, it looked exactly like a woman holding a blade. I stared for barely a second. Then I blinked. The figure was gone. Empty corridor. Nothing there. Then I heard footsteps again. This time, they seemed to be coming closer to me. That was the point where I stopped trying to understand anything. I ran. I went straight out of the house. I did not search the bedrooms again. I did not check behind doors. I did not call out to whoever might have been there. I left. My friend's house was about 10 minutes away, and I went there as quickly as I could. Once I arrived, I told her what had happened. The footsteps, the corridor, the silhouette, the thing that looked like a knife. She told me it was probably my imagination. She said I should not think too much about it. I understood why she said that. From the outside, the story sounds exactly like someone frightening themselves while alone. You hear a noise. You remember the strange chair incident. You become nervous. Then you see a shadow and your brain turns it into a person. That is a completely reasonable explanation. But while it was happening, it did not feel imaginary. I felt as though somebody was in the house. After spending some time at my friend's place, I eventually went back home. I did not want to sleep in my own room that night. I slept in my parents' room instead. I live with my mom most of the time because my dad works as a captain on a ship and is away for long periods. I usually only see him every couple of months. That means there are times when the house can feel especially empty when my mom is gone. Normally, that does not bother me. After the corridor incident, it did. The next day, I started researching the area. I wanted to know whether other people had reported anything strange. Hauntings, deaths in the house, stories about the neighborhood, anything. I could not find anything directly connected to the house. No ghost stories, no famous haunting, nothing that explained what I had seen. The only historical detail I came across was that the village and surrounding area had apparently been affected by fighting connected to the conflict between Greece and Turkey in the 19th century, and that many people had died in the wider area. Once I read that, my mind immediately started trying to connect it to the silhouette. Maybe the woman had died during the fighting. Maybe she had lived somewhere nearby. Maybe what I saw was someone from the past. That is an easy connection to make after something frightening happens. But I also know that history by itself does not prove anything. A lot of places have seen war. A lot of towns are built on land where people died. If every historical death created a visible ghost, almost every old city in the world would be full of them. So I cannot honestly say the silhouette was connected to that history. I only know that I found the information afterward, and because I was already looking for an explanation, it felt important. The chair incident is still the first thing I try to explain normally. Office chairs can move. Wheels do not always sit perfectly still. Floors can be slightly sloped without you noticing. If the chair had been pushed into a position where one wheel was under tension, it could have remained there for a while and then rolled once the weight shifted. Maybe I bumped the mattress and the bed touched the chair. Maybe my foot had moved it slightly without me noticing. Maybe vibrations through the floor caused it to roll. The notification appearing at the same moment may have had nothing to do with the movement. That timing is what made it seem intentional. Computer notification. Chair moves toward computer. It looked like a response, but two things can happen together without one causing the other. The notification did not physically need to move the chair for my brain to connect them. If the chair had rolled 30 seconds earlier, maybe I would have thought the floor was uneven. Because the screen lit up at almost the same moment, the movement suddenly looked deliberate, almost like someone invisible had been sitting there and moved the chair back. That interpretation came from timing, not proof. I also cannot be completely certain about exactly where the chair started. I remember it being beside the bed. I remember watching it move toward the desk. But memory is not a security camera. Especially after something scares you, your brain tends to preserve the most dramatic version of the sequence. Maybe the chair moved less distance than I remember. Maybe it rotated rather than rolling completely underneath the desk. Maybe one wheel caught and suddenly released. I never measured anything. I ran. The second incident has even more possible explanations. Footsteps inside houses are notoriously difficult to locate. Pipes can knock. Wood can shift. Neighbors can walk around. Sounds travel through walls, floors, and ceilings. Something that seems to be coming from a hallway may actually be outside or in another part of the building. If there are nearby houses, apartments, or shared structures, footsteps can appear much closer than they really are. Even a person walking outside near the wall could create a rhythm that sounds like movement indoors. Once I heard the first few steps and became alert, I was probably listening for more. That matters. The brain is a pattern-finding machine. A few random knocks become footsteps once you expect footsteps. Then, every similar sound strengthens the interpretation. Step, step, step. Somebody is walking. Maybe nobody was. The silhouette is also something I have thought about a lot. I saw it briefly. That is important. I did not stand there studying a clear woman for several minutes. I looked toward the corridor and perceived a human-shaped figure. Then I blinked, and it was gone. Brief visual impressions are extremely easy to misinterpret. A hanging coat, a partially open door, a shadow, furniture, something reflected from a screen, light coming through a window. When you are already afraid, the brain prefers to identify ambiguous shapes as possible threats. That is useful from a survival point of view. If something might be a person holding a weapon, it is safer for your brain to react first and analyze later. Unfortunately, that also means harmless shapes can become terrifying. The object that looked like a knife is especially uncertain. Once my brain recognized woman, any narrow shape beside the hand could become knife. A door handle, a piece of furniture, a shadow line, the edge of clothing. Anything. I am not saying I definitely imagined it, only that I saw it for too short a time to know what the object actually was. The fact that it vanished when I blinked also points toward some kind of visual misperception. Maybe blinking changed the way light hit my eyes. Maybe I shifted my head slightly. Maybe the phone screen had left an afterimage. I had been watching YouTube. Bright phone screens create temporary visual effects, especially when you look suddenly into a darker hallway. If there was a bright human shape or high contrast image on my screen, an afterimage could briefly appear against the corridor. That would be a very ordinary way to see something shaped where nothing was actually standing. Once I saw the figure, the later footsteps became much more frightening. Before the silhouette, I was investigating. After the silhouette, I believed there might be danger. Then, when I heard another sound, my brain interpreted it as approaching footsteps. That does not prove they were coming toward me. Fear changes distance. Sound that was previously somewhere in the corridor suddenly feels closer because you are waiting for someone to emerge. Still, I think leaving the house was the right decision. Not because I think the silhouette was definitely a ghost, because I could not rule out a real person. If you are home alone and believe someone may be inside with a weapon, searching the house by yourself is not the best option. Getting somewhere safe is reasonable. If there had actually been an intruder, staying to investigate could have ended badly. So even if the entire thing was shadows and house noises, I do not regret running. What I would avoid doing is assuming that because the windows were locked, there could not possibly have been another person inside. Windows are not the only way people enter homes. Maybe a door had been unlocked earlier. Maybe someone had access. Maybe I overlooked something. There was no evidence of an intruder afterward, so I do not think that explanation is especially likely. But in the moment, treating the possibility seriously made sense. The fact that nothing was missing or disturbed afterward also matters. There was no broken lock, no open door, no footprints, no person found, no repeated sightings immediately afterward. That makes a perception or sound explanation much stronger. The strange thing is how much the first incident influenced the second. If the chair had never moved, maybe I would have heard the hallway footsteps and ignored them. If I saw the silhouette, I might have blamed shadows. But I already had one unexplained memory from being alone in the house. So when something happened again, my brain connected them immediately. Chair moves. Days later, footsteps, then woman. Now it feels like a pattern. Maybe something lives here. That is how haunting stories begin. The problem is that patterns can be created by unrelated events. A chair rolls because of gravity. A pipe knocks. A shadow resembles a person. 3 normal events become one supernatural story because they happen to the same person in the same house. That does not mean the story is false. The experiences happened. The connection is what remains uncertain. I also think researching the local history probably strengthened the ghost interpretation. After something unexplained happens, you naturally search for meaning. If you find a past war, a death, a fire, an old cemetery, or some tragedy, suddenly the event has a possible identity. The woman becomes a dead resident. The footsteps become soldiers. The moving chair becomes activity from the same presence. But almost any old area contains enough history to create a story if you search long enough. That is why I try not to treat the historical information as confirmation. The figure did not wear clothing I could identify from a specific period. She did not speak. She did not give me a name. I did not see a face. There was no reason, based only on what I saw, to connect her to any particular war. That connection came afterward. Maybe what frightened me most was how ordinary both incidents started. I was not doing a ritual. I was not visiting an abandoned building. I was not looking for ghosts. The first time, I was listening to lo-fi music in my bedroom. The second time, I was watching YouTube in the living room. Those are probably 2 of the least dramatic activities imaginable. Then, suddenly, an ordinary object moves. Later, familiar house sounds become footsteps. A dark corridor produces a human shape. The familiar becomes uncertain. That is what makes being alone unsettling. Every object in your house has a normal place and normal behavior. The chair stays where you leave it. The hallway stays empty. The bedrooms remain quiet. Once something breaks that pattern, the entire house feels different. After the chair moved, I looked at my room differently for a few days. After the silhouette, I looked at the corridor differently. Even though nothing physically changed, I had added a new possibility. Something might happen again. That expectation itself can make you notice more. A small creak becomes important. A shadow makes you look twice. Your nervous system stays ready. That can create a feedback loop. Fear makes you more observant. Greater observation reveals more ordinary noises. Those noises create more fear. Eventually, the house feels active, even if everything has a physical cause. That is something I try to remember. I still do not know what moved the chair. Maybe it rolled because of the floor. Maybe I accidentally displaced it. Maybe there was some simple mechanical reason I never found. And I do not know exactly what I saw in the corridor. The most likely explanation is some combination of low light, afterimages, expectation, and an ordinary shape. But I cannot prove that either. What I know is that I saw enough to become frightened. And when I heard what sounded like footsteps approaching after the figure disappeared, I did not care whether the cause was supernatural or human. I got out. I hope nothing like that happens again. I do not need another sighting to prove anything. If anything, I would rather discover a boring explanation. An uneven floor, a loose chair wheel, pipes in the wall, a reflection from my phone. Anything, those answers would be better than continuing to wonder. For now, all I can do is separate what happened from what I think it meant. I saw a chair move toward my desk while I was lying on my bed. Nobody else was in the room. Days later, while home alone again, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the corridor. I checked the bedrooms and found no sign of entry. When I returned to the living room, I briefly saw what looked like a woman standing in the corridor with something sharp in her hand. I blinked. She was gone. Then the footsteps seemed to come closer. I ran out of the house. Everything beyond that is interpretation. Maybe the chair and the figure were unrelated. Maybe neither was paranormal. Maybe my friend's explanation was right, and fear did most of the work. Maybe the area's history had nothing whatsoever to do with it. That is probably the safest conclusion. But I still remember how quickly the second incident changed from confusing to terrifying. I had been staring at an empty corridor, trying to decide whether the footsteps were real. Then, for one brief moment, it was no longer empty. There was a woman-shaped silhouette there. Something thin and sharp seemed to hang from her hand. I blinked. Nothing. Then came another step. And another. Closer, I did not stay to find out whether something would eventually come around the corner. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago, and it is still one of those memories that comes back to me at random times. A friend of mine had 2 tiny dogs. I do not remember the exact breed, but they were the kind of little teacup-sized dogs that looked like they weighed almost nothing. Because of where we lived, daytime walks were miserable for a large part of the year. The heat was brutal, so we usually took the dogs out at night. It was cooler then, and the neighborhood was generally quiet. Most nights were completely normal. We would walk around, talking about whatever was going on in our lives. The dogs would stop every few feet to smell something, and then we would eventually head home. We never treated the walks like anything dangerous. It was just something we did. One night, we were walking through the neighborhood when we noticed a car parked in a driveway. The dome light inside the car was on. That caught my attention because the street itself was fairly dark. The inside of the car was illuminated, and there was a man sitting in it. I do not remember exactly what he looked like. What I remember clearly is the feeling. Something seemed off. Maybe it was the way he was sitting. Maybe it was just the fact that he was sitting alone in a parked car at night with the interior light on. We did not know him. We were not trying to find out who he was. We simply crossed to the other side of the street. It was not a dramatic decision. We were not running away. We just did not want to walk directly past the driveway. We had the dogs with us, and they were tiny enough that if anything happened, they would not exactly protect us. So we moved across the road and kept walking. Then the man got out of the car. That was when things changed. He started screaming, not yelling words, not shouting at us to leave, not asking what we were doing. He was just screaming. That is the part I still hear in my head. It was not normal anger where somebody is clearly arguing with another person. There were no understandable sentences. It was just raw screaming, loud, aggressive, completely uncontrolled. We did not wait around. Both of us immediately picked up the dogs. The whole point was to move faster. If the dogs were walking on leashes, they would slow us down. So we grabbed them and started getting away from there as quickly as we could without turning the situation into an obvious chase. I remember trying not to look back too much. I did not know whether he was screaming at us. Maybe he was screaming at someone inside the house. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe he was simply an unstable person sitting in his own driveway. At that moment, none of those possibilities mattered. We only knew we did not want to be near him. We got back to my friend's house and told her mother's boyfriend what had happened. We described the car, the man, the screaming, where the house was. He took it seriously, much more seriously than I expected. He told us to stay home. Then he went over there himself. Of course, we did not actually stay home like we were told. We were young, curious, and already worked up from what had happened. We wanted to know what was going on. So even though he had specifically told us not to follow, we eventually went after him. Looking back, that was stupid. We had already encountered one person behaving aggressively. We had no idea what was happening inside that house. There could have been weapons, more people, anything. But at the time, curiosity overpowered common sense. By the time we got close enough to see what was happening, my friend's mom's boyfriend was at the house. He went up to the front door. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. From outside, the house did not give an obvious explanation for the man in the driveway. Nobody came to the door. No one opened a window. Nothing. Then he moved around toward the electrical breaker box. For whatever reason, he shut off the power to the house. At the time, I did not fully understand why. Maybe he thought it would force whoever was inside to come out. Maybe he wanted to interrupt whatever was happening. Maybe he heard something we could not hear from where we were. I do not know. A neighbor noticed what was going on and called the police. Eventually, officers arrived. The man was arrested. At that point, we still did not know the full story. We knew the guy had been screaming. We knew something had worried my friend's mom's boyfriend enough that he had stayed at the house. And we knew the police had taken someone away. That alone would have made the night memorable. But later, we learned what had apparently been happening inside. That is the part that turned the memory into something much darker. 2 sisters lived in the house. Both were blind. According to what we were told afterward, While my friend's mom's boyfriend was pounding on the door, he could hear screaming from inside. Not only the man's voice, he heard two women screaming in fear. The man had allegedly been sexually assaulting them. When I learned that, the entire night changed in my memory. The screaming in the driveway no longer seemed like some random drunk guy acting crazy. It became connected to something much worse. Two vulnerable women had apparently been inside that house while we were walking past with those tiny dogs, talking about normal things, having no idea what was happening only a short distance away. That realization still bothers me. There is something uniquely disturbing about being close to a terrible situation without knowing it. You think you are simply taking a nighttime walk. You see a strange man. You avoid him. You go home. Then later, somebody tells you that something horrific was happening inside the house you just passed. It makes the whole neighborhood feel different. Before that night, the houses around us were mostly just backgrounds. Windows, driveways, cars, porch lights. You rarely think about what is happening behind every closed door. Most of the time, nothing unusual is happening. People are eating dinner, watching television, sleeping, arguing about bills, doing homework. Normal life. That night reminded me that you can walk 10 feet from a house and have absolutely no idea what is happening inside it. That scared me more than any ghost story ever could. There was nothing supernatural about what happened. No strange figure, no unexplained sound, no shadow moving in an empty room. There was a real man, real people inside, and real danger. I think that is why the memory stayed so strong. You can explain away a weird noise. You can convince yourself that a shadow was just a coat. You can tell yourself a ghost story was probably imagination. There is no comfortable explanation for what we were told happened in that house. It was human. That is worse. For a long time, I replayed the moment when we first saw the man sitting in the car. I wondered whether there was anything we should have noticed earlier. Was he watching us? Had he just come outside from the house? Was he trying to scare us away? Had he seen that two people were walking past and panicked because he thought we might notice something? I do not know. Maybe his screaming had nothing to do with us. Maybe he was already in some kind of rage before we arrived. But in hindsight, every little detail starts feeling loaded. The dome light, the fact that he was sitting in the driveway, the sudden screaming, the way we crossed the street, our instinct to get away. It is easy to turn those things into clues after you know the ending. At the time, they were only strange. That is something I try to remember. Hindsight creates patterns. Once you know someone was dangerous, every earlier action looks obviously dangerous too. But if we had never learned what happened inside, I might remember him as nothing more than a disturbed man who screamed at us. The later information changed everything. I also think a lot about my friend's mom's boyfriend. When we told him, he could have laughed. He could have said we were overreacting. He could have told us the guy was probably drunk and to forget about it. Instead, he went over there. I do not know whether that was the safest choice. Walking up to a house where an aggressive stranger may be inside can be dangerous. But his decision to check clearly mattered, especially if he really heard those women screaming. At that point, the situation was no longer about some guy acting weird in his driveway. There were people inside who may have needed help. The neighbor calling the police mattered too. That is another detail I remember differently now. At the time, having police show up probably felt like the situation suddenly becoming serious. Looking back, calling them was exactly what should have happened once there was reason to think someone inside was in danger. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if nobody had checked, if we had simply gone home and said nothing. Maybe another neighbor would have heard something. Maybe police would have arrived eventually for another reason. Maybe the women would have been able to get help themselves. I hope so, but I do not know. That uncertainty is difficult. I do not want to turn the story into some heroic rescue narrative, because that is not how it felt. We were not heroes. We were two people walking dogs. We got scared and left. Then, we told an adult. That was it. My friend's mom's boyfriend made the decision to investigate. A neighbor made the decision to call police. The officers handled what followed. What happened to the sisters afterward is not something I know enough about to talk about. I only know what we were told about why the man was arrested. Even now, I try to be careful with that. I was not inside the house. I did not witness the assault. I learned about it afterward. So the details I can personally stand behind are the ones I saw. The car in the driveway, the dome light, the man getting out, the screaming, us picking up the dogs and leaving, my friend's mom's boyfriend going over, the unanswered door, the police arriving, the arrest. The rest came from what we were told later. But that information is what made the event impossible to forget. For weeks afterward, I remember being more aware when we walked at night. Every car with someone sitting inside seemed suspicious. Every dark window made me wonder whether somebody was watching. If we heard shouting from a house, we noticed, it was difficult not to. One frightening experience can change how you read ordinary things. Before, a parked car was a parked car. Afterward, I looked at the person inside. Before, somebody yelling might have been a domestic argument or a drunk person being stupid. Afterward, I wondered whether somebody else was in danger. That kind of hyper-awareness eventually fades. You cannot live your whole life assuming every house hides something terrible. Most do not. But the knowledge never completely leaves. It taught me something uncomfortable about instincts. When we first saw the man, we crossed the street before he had technically done anything to us. There was just something about the situation that made us not want to pass close by. Then he got out and started screaming. That confirmed our discomfort. People sometimes talk about instinct as though it is some supernatural sixth sense. I do not think it is. Usually, your brain is noticing small things before you consciously identify them. Body language, posture, where somebody is looking, how still they are. The fact that a situation does not fit normal behavior. Maybe we picked up on something like that. Or maybe we simply crossed because it was safer not to walk right beside an unknown man sitting in a car at night. Either way, I am glad we did. If he had been in a rage, being closer could have put us in his path. The dogs also made the whole thing feel surreal. They were tiny. We went from casually walking these ridiculous little animals to suddenly scooping them up and getting away from a screaming man. That contrast is part of the memory. One moment, everything is ordinary enough to be boring. The next, your body is telling you to leave. Nothing about the night gave us warning before that. No ominous feeling. No strange weather. No reason to expect trouble. It was hot outside. We walked at night because it was cooler. That was all. The worst real-life stories often start like that. There is no build-up. Real danger does not care whether the scene feels dramatic enough. It enters normal life suddenly. Sometimes through something as small as noticing a car light. I also cannot imagine what the two sisters experienced. I do not try to. What we were told was already enough. The fact that they were blind made the story hit even harder because it added another layer of vulnerability. But I do not want to reduce them to that. They were two people in a terrifying situation who deserved safety. That is the part that matters. The man being arrested does not make what happened disappear. It only means the situation was interrupted. I hope they had support afterward. I hope they were protected. I hope they were able to recover as much as possible. I do not know. Our connection to their story ended almost immediately after that night. But their situation stayed in my mind. People sometimes ask why certain memories remain vivid years later. For me, it is usually because something changes your understanding of the world. That night did that. I had always understood, intellectually, that dangerous people existed. Everyone does. You hear crime stories. Parents tell you not to talk to strangers. You watch the news. But those dangers remain distant until you encounter something close enough to make them physical. That night, danger lived in a normal-looking house in a normal neighborhood. We had walked right past it before, probably many times. Nothing about the building itself announced what happened there. That is hard to accept. It would almost be easier if dangerous places looked dangerous. Broken windows, dark abandoned buildings, warning signs. But real life is not arranged that way. Terrible things can happen behind clean doors. That is what stayed with me. The man himself also stayed with me because of the screaming. I have never forgotten that sound. Not words, just screaming. At the time, it seemed almost impossible to interpret. Was he angry? Terrified? Trying to intimidate us? We did not know. Once we learned what had allegedly happened, I associated the sound with rage, but I have to admit that is partly hindsight, too. I only knew it was aggressive enough to scare us. We did not wait around to analyze it. We did the smart thing. Picked up the dogs. Left, told someone. I think about the fact that my friend's mom's boyfriend told us to stay home, and we ignored him. If I could go back, that is one thing I would change. We had already done what we needed to do. We had told an adult. Following him toward an unknown situation accomplished nothing except putting ourselves closer to danger. Curiosity is powerful when you are young. You feel safe because an adult is nearby. But if the man had come outside with a weapon, or if more people had been involved, being there would have made everything worse. We were lucky nothing happened to us. That is another lesson the memory left behind. When something genuinely dangerous may be happening, you do not need to become part of the investigation. Get somewhere safe. Call the appropriate people. Let trained responders deal with it. Real life is not a horror movie where you need to open the basement door to prove what is inside. Sometimes leaving is the smartest thing you can do. That is essentially what we had already done after seeing the man. We trusted our discomfort. We left. It worked. The rest of the story happened because adults followed up. Over the years, I have sometimes wondered whether every detail we later heard was accurate. Stories spread quickly in neighborhoods. Information gets simplified. Maybe some details were wrong. Maybe what we heard about the investigation was incomplete. I did not read court records. I did not personally speak with the sisters. So I do not claim knowledge beyond what was told to us. That uncertainty does not change the basic memory. Something serious enough happened that police arrived and the man was taken away. And what we were told afterward was horrifying. That is enough. I think it is important because sometimes people tell frightening stories and add certainty afterward. They say, we found out exactly what happened. But often, especially when you are young, you only know pieces. This is one of those memories. I know what I witnessed. I know what I was told. There is a line between those things. The line does not make the story less disturbing. If anything, it makes it feel more real. Life rarely gives you complete information. You see part of an event. Someone else sees another part. Police learn more. Neighbors talk. Years later, you still carry the piece that belonged to you. My piece starts with two tiny dogs. A hot place where nighttime was the only comfortable time to walk them. A quiet street, a parked car with its dome light on, then a man stepping out and beginning to scream. We crossed the street before that. Maybe instinct, maybe caution. Either way, I am thankful for it. We picked up the dogs and left when the situation became clearly wrong. That was the last moment when the night still belonged entirely to us. After that, the story became about something happening inside a house we had no idea about. Sometimes I think about how close we were. Maybe only a front lawn and a wall separated us from those women. We were outside carrying tiny dogs and trying to get away from a screaming stranger. Inside, if what we were later told was accurate, two people were experiencing something far worse. We had no idea. That is what still messes with me. Not the thought of ghosts, not darkness, not a strange house. The fact that ordinary life and terrible things can exist within a few feet of each other. You can be laughing. Someone else can be terrified. You can walk past. You can hear something strange and not understand what it means until later. I do not think I will ever completely forget the man getting out of that car. Maybe because in that instant he was only a mystery. Just some stranger screaming on a hot night. Then later we learned the context. And the memory became something else entirely. Now when I replay it, I do not only remember his voice. I remember the unanswered door. I remember my friend's mom's boyfriend staying there. I remember police arriving. I remember learning that two blind sisters lived inside. And I remember realizing that the scariest thing we had encountered that night was never anything supernatural. It was a human being.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
I have only had sleep paralysis twice in my life, and both times were terrifying. I know people joke about sleep paralysis sometimes, especially when the thing they see sounds ridiculous afterward, but when you are actually experiencing it, there is nothing funny about it. At least there was nothing funny about mine. The worst part is that I knew I was in my own room. I knew I was in bed. I could see familiar things around me. The room looked real because as far as I could tell, I was awake. But my body would not move. I could not sit up. I could not turn over. I could not properly call for anyone. And while I was trapped there, something else seemed to be in the room with me. For some people, sleep paralysis stories involve shadow people, demons, old women sitting on their chests, figures standing in corners. Mine somehow involved the Teletubbies. Yes, those Teletubbies. The colorful children's television characters. The ones that are supposed to be harmless. The ones little kids watch, dancing around on green hills while a smiling baby appears in the sun. When I am awake, I can laugh about how stupid that sounds. I can make jokes about it. I understand that saying the most terrifying thing I ever saw was a giant Teletubby does not exactly sound like the beginning of a serious horror story. But when I was trapped in sleep paralysis, they were not cute. They were not funny. They were enormous. In the dreamlike version I saw, they looked around 10 feet tall. That is what made them so horrible. Everything familiar about them was still there, but the proportions were completely wrong. They were too tall, too close, too real. Something that was designed to look soft and friendly suddenly looked like it had been scaled up into something that should not exist inside a bedroom. It is difficult to explain how threatening a familiar children's character can become when your brain changes just a few details. A normal Teletubby on a screen is harmless. A 10-foot tall one standing at the end of your bed is something else. And during one of these episodes, I felt like I was being held down. I could not move. There was pressure. The sensation was strong enough that I felt as though something physically had me pinned to the mattress. Then there was singing. That is one of the details that stayed with me. They were standing near the end of the bed, and I remember hearing singing. The whole thing had this horrible combination of childish and threatening. That may have been what made it worse. If I had seen some obvious monster growling at me, at least the image would have made sense. Monster looks scary. Monster acts scary. Fine, but this was something associated with children's television. Something colorful. Something that was supposed to be safe. And it was singing while I could not move. That contrast made the whole experience feel deeply wrong. I knew I wanted to get away. My body would not cooperate. I wanted to close my eyes. I wanted to turn my head. I wanted to pull a blanket over myself. I wanted to shout. Nothing happened. It is hard to describe that helplessness unless you have experienced it. When you have a nightmare, usually you can wake up. Maybe you sit straight up. Maybe you turn on a light. Maybe you realize immediately that it was only a dream. Sleep paralysis seems to take away that escape. You feel awake enough to know where you are, but your body is still stuck in sleep. So the frightening image does not stay safely inside a dream. It appears to exist in the same room as you. That is what made the Teletubbies terrifying for me. They were not somewhere in some dream landscape. They were at the end of my bed, in my room, close enough that I felt trapped with them. I only had sleep paralysis twice, which I am extremely thankful for. Twice was enough. Some people apparently experience it regularly. I cannot imagine dealing with that every week or every month. After the episodes, I was obviously able to move again. The figures were gone. The room returned to normal. During the day, the whole thing became easier to talk about. That is where the joking started. I could laugh at the idea. Teletubbies? Really? Of all the possible things my brain could create, that was what it chose? It sounds absurd, and I think laughing about it helped. Humor makes frightening memories easier to carry. If I call them those motherfrickers and joke about how scary they are, I get to control the story a little. I am no longer the person trapped in bed. I am the person telling a ridiculous story about being attacked by giant children's characters. But the fear underneath the joke is still real. That is something people do not always understand. You can laugh about something that genuinely terrified you. The laughter does not mean the original fear was fake. Sometimes joking is the easiest way to talk about something without feeling vulnerable. Even now, when I am awake, I know Teletubbies are not dangerous. They are television characters. I can see a picture and laugh. I can make jokes. I know they cannot come into my room. But dreams do not care what I believe when I am awake. For some reason, when I have certain nightmares, they show up differently. My brain takes something harmless and turns it into something threatening. That actually makes sense when I think about how nightmares work. They often use familiar things. A normal house becomes wrong. A family member's face looks slightly different. A toy starts moving. A familiar hallway becomes impossible. The fear does not always come from something completely unknown. Sometimes it comes from something known being changed just enough that it feels unsafe. The Teletubbies fit that perfectly. They already have exaggerated shapes. Large heads, bright colors, simple faces, strange television set shapes on their stomachs. They do not look like normal humans. When they are small on a screen, that is fine. Make them 10 feet tall and place them in a dark bedroom, and suddenly every unusual feature becomes disturbing. I did not choose that deliberately. My sleeping brain did. The singing probably came from the same place. Teletubbies are associated with simple sounds, repetitive language, songs, and children's voices. So my brain took something that normally belongs in that world and placed it into a situation where I was paralyzed. That makes the song feel more threatening than silence would. It is like hearing a nursery rhyme in an empty building. The words may not be scary. The context makes them scary. I also think the feeling of being held down is probably one reason the figures seemed so real. If I had simply seen them at the end of the bed, I might have thought I was dreaming. But my body felt trapped. That physical sensation gave the image more credibility. Something is stopping me from moving. There is something in the room. Therefore, those things must be doing it. That is the immediate logic. Now I understand that sleep paralysis itself can involve the sensation of pressure or being restrained. The brain wakes while the body is still in the temporary muscle inhibition associated with sleep. You try to move. Nothing happens. Because that is frightening, the mind may search for a reason. Someone is holding me. Something is sitting on me. Something has pinned my arms. The physical state is real. The explanation created during the episode may not be. Knowing that afterward is useful. Knowing it during the experience would have been much harder. When you are in it, logic is not exactly operating normally. Your brain is already caught between sleeping and waking. Fear arrives before analysis. I have also wondered why Teletubbies specifically became part of my nightmares. I do not have some dramatic childhood trauma connected to the show. I do not remember being terrified of them all the time when I was awake. Maybe I always found them slightly uncanny without admitting it. Maybe I saw them at a young enough age that their shapes stayed somewhere deep in memory. Maybe there is no meaningful reason at all. Dreams can choose bizarre material. Sometimes you wake up from a nightmare and wonder why your brain picked that particular image. There may be no deeper message. It may simply be an association. What matters is that in the dream state, they scare me. That is true even if I can joke about them 5 minutes after waking. Eventually, I told someone about it. At the time, I had this friend who was also kind of a bully. The relationship was strange. We started the school year as friends. Then, over time, he became meaner. We were still around each other enough that I guess frenemies is probably the best description. Sometimes he acted like a friend. Other times, he would make fun of me. You never really knew which version you were going to get. I told him about the sleep paralysis. I do not remember exactly why. Maybe I trusted him that day. Maybe we were talking about nightmares. Maybe I thought he would understand that even though the Teletubbies part sounded ridiculous, the experience itself had terrified me. Instead, he turned it into another thing to make fun of. I do not know whether he genuinely did not believe me. Maybe he believed I had experienced sleep paralysis, but thought the characters were funny. Maybe he did not understand how serious it felt. Maybe teasing was simply what he did whenever somebody revealed something personal. Whatever the reason, he did not treat it like something that had scared me. That hurt more than I expected. It is a strange feeling when you tell someone about one of the most frightening moments of your life and they use it as material for jokes, especially when you already feel embarrassed by part of the story. If I had seen a shadow demon, maybe people would react differently. But giant Teletubbies gives people an easy opening to laugh. They hear the character and forget the rest. They forget that I could not move. They forget that I felt held down. They forget that I thought something 10 feet tall was standing at the end of my bed. They just hear Teletubbies. Funny, my last name apparently made the joke even easier. If you twist it enough, he decided it sounded vaguely like Teletubbies. So he started calling me something like Re-Teletubbies. It became a nickname. For him, it was probably just another stupid school joke. For me, it was connected to something I had told him, because it genuinely scared me. That is the part that sucked. I think sometimes people believe that if something sounds funny, it cannot also be traumatic or frightening. But fear is not required to make sense to anyone else. A person can be terrified of clowns while another person thinks clowns are hilarious. Someone can panic around dogs even if the dog is friendly. A particular song can make someone uncomfortable because of a memory attached to it. The thing itself does not have to be objectively dangerous. The fear belongs to the experience. During my episodes, the Teletubbies were terrifying because my brain made them terrifying. That does not mean I believe Teletubbies are secretly evil. It means my brain used their appearance during a state where I could not move. That is enough. When I think about the episodes now, the sleep paralysis explanation makes much more sense than anything supernatural. I do not think actual 10-foot-tall creatures entered my bedroom. I do not think something physically held me down. I think I was awake enough to perceive my room, but still partly dreaming. My body had not fully come out of sleep. The figures in singing were probably dream imagery being projected into a real environment. That explanation fits. It also explains why the whole thing ended without anything physically happening. Once I could move again, there were no enormous footprints, no damaged furniture, no characters standing in the hallway. The room was normal. That does not make the episode less frightening. If anything, it makes me respect how convincing the brain can be. It created something I knew was impossible and made it feel completely present. I was not choosing to imagine it. I was not lying there thinking, what if a giant Teletubby appeared? It simply happened. That is one reason I wish people took sleep paralysis stories more seriously, even when the details sound funny. The content can be absurd. The fear can still be intense. There is a difference between laughing with someone afterward and mocking them because they trusted you. I can laugh at my own story. That does not automatically give someone else permission to turn it into a weapon. When I joke about those motherfrickers being 10 feet tall, I am choosing the joke. That feels different. Someone else repeatedly attaching it to my name after I told them it was one of the scariest experiences I had ever had does not feel the same. It makes you regret telling them. You start thinking maybe next time you should keep things to yourself. That is probably the part of the story I dislike most now. The sleep paralysis ended. The figures disappeared. But the embarrassment lasted because another person kept bringing it back. I also understand that he may not have known what to do with the story. We were young. People that age are not always good at responding to vulnerability. Sometimes somebody tells you something serious and you make a joke because you are uncomfortable. Sometimes teasing is how people try to keep a friendship feeling casual. But there is a point where it stops being harmless. If the person tells you it bothers them and you keep doing it, then the joke is no longer about making both people laugh. It is about getting a reaction. That was what our friendship often felt like. Friend 1 minute. Bully the next. It was confusing. The nickname was just one example. The irony is that the Teletubbies are much less frightening to me when I am awake than the idea of having sleep paralysis again. That is the real fear. If I saw a Teletubby costume at some event, I could probably laugh. But waking up unable to move? That is something I never want again. Because once your body does not respond, you no longer trust what comes next. You do not know whether your brain is going to show you an empty room or put something beside the bed. And because I have experienced it twice, I know how real the hallucination can feel. That is the part people cannot understand from hearing the story. The room does not suddenly become cartoonish. It does not feel like an obvious dream. You are lying in the same bed, looking at the same walls. Everything feels normal enough that the impossible thing becomes more convincing. If a giant character appeared in a normal dream, I might not care. Dreams are weird. But when it seems to be standing inside your actual bedroom, your brain reacts differently. The familiar room makes the impossible image feel physical. I sometimes wonder whether my fear of them in later nightmares was reinforced by that first episode. Maybe the original sleep paralysis used the characters randomly. Then the experience scared me so badly that my brain learned these things are dangerous in dreams. After that, whenever I had another nightmare, they became easier material to reuse. Fear can train itself. You have one frightening experience with an image. Then the next time you see the image in a dream, you are already scared. That fear makes the dream worse. The worst dream strengthens the association. Eventually, something completely harmless in waking life becomes one of the most reliable nightmare triggers. That could easily explain why Teletubbies became such a recurring nightmare image for me. It is not that I secretly believe they are monsters. It is that my sleeping brain remembers what happened the last time they appeared. Thankfully, the sleep paralysis itself has only happened twice. I hope it stays that way. I can handle a normal nightmare. Wake up, turn on the light, check the room, go back to sleep. Sleep paralysis is different. It takes away the simple action that proves you are safe. Movement. You cannot sit up and break the illusion. You cannot immediately reach for your phone. You cannot turn away from the thing you are seeing. You are forced to stay there until your body catches up. A few seconds can feel much longer. That is what I remember more clearly than anything else. The helplessness. And the absurdity of the thing causing the terror does not change that. Maybe, in some way, the ridiculousness helped me afterward. I could tell myself, come on, they are Teletubbies. That gave me enough distance to turn the memory into something I could joke about. Maybe if the image had been more traditionally horrifying, it would have been harder to talk about. But joking was only useful when I was the one doing it. I still wish my friend had understood that. If someone tells you, this thing happened to me and it terrified me, the important part is not whether you personally find the image scary. The important part is that they did. You do not have to believe giant creatures were really in the room. I do not believe that myself. You only have to believe that the fear was real. Mine was. I knew afterward that nothing had physically attacked me. I knew the Teletubbies were not real. I knew sleep paralysis could explain the whole thing. But during those moments, I was trapped underneath something I could not see clearly, staring toward the end of my bed at figures that seemed impossibly tall while they sang. That was real enough for me. And I think that is why the teasing bothered me. I had given someone the ridiculous surface of the story and trusted him to understand the serious part underneath. Instead, he took the easiest thing to laugh at and kept it. Years later, I can tell the story and laugh too. I can call them terrifying motherfrickers. I can joke that nothing should be allowed to be 10 feet tall and sing children's songs at the end of somebody's bed. That part genuinely is funny now. But the memory underneath it is still one of the scariest things I have experienced while asleep. 2 times was enough, more than enough, because I know what probably happened. My body was still asleep. My mind was partly awake. The pressure was probably part of the paralysis. The singing and figures were probably dream imagery. Nothing supernatural needed to be in the room. That is the rational explanation, and I believe it. But knowing the explanation afterward and experiencing it in the moment are two completely different things. In the moment, I was not thinking about REM sleep. I was not thinking about hallucinations. I was not thinking about how the brain can blend dreams with the real bedroom. I was thinking one thing: move, and I could not. At the end of the bed stood something enormous that should have been harmless. 10 feet tall, colorful, familiar, singing. And somehow, in that moment, the stupid Teletubbies were the most terrifying things in the world. This happened on the first Wednesday of spring break in 2019. I was almost 14 at the time, and I had a little 50cc dirt bike that I liked riding around the hills near my house. The area was familiar to me. I was not going somewhere I had never been before, and I was not deliberately looking for anything creepy. It was just one of those days where I wanted to get outside, ride for a while, and kill some time during spring break. There were trails cutting through the hills, and I had ridden around there before. Nothing about that afternoon felt unusual at first. I got on the bike and headed toward the entrance to the trails. To get in, I had to ride up a small hill. As I started climbing, I noticed a smell. It was strong enough that I remember it immediately. My first thought was that there had to be a dead animal nearby. That would not have been impossible. There was wildlife around the hills, and animals die. Coyotes, rabbits, deer in some areas. Pets that get loose. Anything could end up dead somewhere off a trail. The smell was unpleasant, but I did not stop because of it. I assumed there was a carcass somewhere nearby that I could not see. I reached the top of the hill and continued. I rode maybe another 100 feet forward along the trail. Then I took a left. That section dropped downhill and connected to the rest of the trails. I knew where I was going. I was thinking about riding, not about the smell anymore. Then I saw something standing in the road. At first, I could not understand what I was looking at. It was maybe 150 feet away from me. Far enough that I was not seeing tiny details perfectly, but close enough that whatever it was looked completely wrong. It was standing sideways to me. The first thing that registered was the height. It looked enormous. In my memory, it seemed 8 or 9 feet tall, maybe taller than any person I had ever seen in real life. Its legs looked strange, too. The knees seemed bent inward. Not like someone simply standing awkwardly. The entire posture looked wrong. Then I noticed the torso. That was the part that scared me most. It looked like there was no skin covering parts of the rib cage. I could see what appeared to be ribs. The middle of the body looked so thin that, from where I was standing, it seemed like the torso connected to the hips almost entirely through an exposed spine. It did not look like a normal animal. It did not look like a normal person. There were patches of brown fur on parts of the body, not a full coat. Patchy, uneven, and the head looked like a wolf's. I remember seeing what looked like blood running down from around the head or face. For a few seconds, my brain just stopped trying to name it. There was no category. I was looking at something that seemed to combine pieces that should not have belonged together. Human height, animal head, exposed-looking bones, brown fur, long, strange limbs. The bike was still running. Then the thing heard it. It turned. That movement is still one of the clearest parts of the memory. It did not just move its head slightly. It seemed to turn its whole body toward me. Then it looked directly at me. I looked back. For maybe 5 or 6 seconds, neither of us moved toward the other. That does not sound like a long time when you say it out loud. 5 seconds, 6 seconds. But when you are looking at something you cannot identify, and every instinct is telling you to leave, it feels much longer. I remember staring because part of me was trying to understand whether I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Maybe it was a person. Maybe someone was wearing something. Maybe an injured animal was standing strangely. Maybe there were two animals overlapping from my angle. Maybe my eyes had put together a shape that was not actually there. But none of those explanations formed quickly enough to calm me down. All I knew was that it was looking at me now. That was enough. I turned the bike around and rode home as fast as that little 50cc could take me. I did not stay to get a better look. I did not take a picture. I did not ride closer. I did not circle around. I left. I remember feeling like I could not get home fast enough. Every second, I expected to look back and see it running after me. I did not know how fast it could move. I did not know whether it had been feeding on something. I did not know whether the dead animal smell had anything to do with it. I was almost 14 and terrified. Going back to investigate was not even a possibility. When I got home, I told my parents what I had seen. I expected them to tell me I was imagining things. Instead, they believed that I had seen something. My grandmother believed me too. She was very religious, and her interpretation was different from mine. My family thought maybe it had been something demonic. They suggested that perhaps I had seen it because I needed to straighten my life out. Almost like something had been sent to scare me back onto the right path. At 14, hearing adults suggest the thing you just saw might literally have been a demon does not exactly help you calm down. If anything, it made the memory worse. I started wondering whether it had deliberately been waiting there. Why that day? Why that trail? Why had it looked at me? Why had it not chased me? Was I supposed to see it? For a while, those questions felt more important than any ordinary explanation. My own thought was that maybe I had seen a Wendigo. That was the closest thing I knew of that matched the image in my head. Tall, thin, unnatural, animal-like. Something from the wilderness that did not look like any normal living thing. The problem was that the stories I knew about Wendigos did not really belong in Southern California. That bothered me. If that was what I had seen, why would it be there? Of course, looking back, that question assumes the answer before proving it. I saw something strange. Then I searched my memory for a creature that looked similar. Wendigo was the label that fit best. That does not mean the thing actually was one. In fact, as I got older, I started thinking more about normal explanations. The first is distance. 150 feet is close enough to see a large animal, but far enough to misjudge proportions, especially on uneven terrain. The hills could have distorted how tall it looked. If it was standing downhill from me, its legs might have seemed longer. If I was slightly above it, the body might have appeared stretched against the background. Without a person or object directly beside it for scale, saying 8 or 9 feet is still an estimate. It looked that tall to me. That does not mean I actually measured it. The animal itself could have been something injured or sick. A severely injured coyote or large dog can look horrifying. Mange can remove huge patches of fur. An animal that has lost weight can show every rib. Open wounds can expose tissue and create shapes that look like bone from a distance. Blood around the head could come from injury or from feeding on a carcass. If a sick or injured animal was standing partly upright on an embankment or with its front legs elevated, that might have distorted the body even more. The problem is that I remember it looking bipedal, human-like in the way it stood. But again, I had only a few seconds to look at it. An animal standing on its hind legs can look shockingly human for a moment. Bears do it. Coyotes and dogs can rear up briefly. Even deer, if badly injured or caught in an odd position, can create a silhouette that does not immediately look like a normal deer. I do not remember antlers. I remember a wolf-like head. But memory is not perfect. Another possibility is that I saw a person wearing something. That explanation sounds ridiculous until you remember that people do strange things in remote areas. Someone could have been wearing an animal hide, a costume, hunting gear. Maybe they had been carrying a carcass. Maybe the exposed ribs were bones from an animal hanging in front of them. Maybe what looked like one creature was actually a person standing beside or behind something dead. At 150 feet, overlap can completely change a silhouette. Suppose a person was standing behind the rib cage of a dead deer or coyote, their legs visible below, an animal head or hide above. For a few seconds, my brain might combine everything into one impossible body. Once that first interpretation locked in, every detail would support it. There is also the smell. At the time, the smell seemed like evidence that the creature itself was rotten or dead. But that is only one interpretation. The smell could simply have come from a carcass nearby. If an animal had died close to the trail, scavengers would be attracted to it. Coyotes, dogs, birds, and other animals could all be feeding there. That makes the smell and the strange creature potentially connected without requiring anything supernatural. Maybe what I saw was an animal that had just been feeding. Blood around its muzzle would make sense. Patchy fur could be mange. Visible ribs could mean starvation or disease. And if it was standing at a strange angle, fear could do the rest. The inward-looking knees are another detail that may have come from anatomy I did not recognize. Animal hind legs do not bend exactly like human legs. When you see an animal upright, especially from an angle, the joints can look backwards or bent incorrectly. Something perfectly normal for that species can look deformed if you expect human anatomy. At almost 14, I was not standing there doing a veterinary analysis. I saw legs that looked wrong. That became knees bent inward. The exposed spine is harder to explain. If I really saw a spinal column connecting the torso to the hips with no surrounding tissue, then whatever I saw could not have been functioning normally as a living animal. But the phrase exposed spine is my interpretation of what the center of the body looked like. A very thin waist, dark fur on either side, a narrow line of lighter material. At a distance, those shapes could become bone if the animal was severely emaciated. The spine might have been extremely prominent without literally being exposed. An animal with advanced mange and starvation can look almost skeletal. In poor light or against dry Southern California terrain, that could look much worse than it really was. I also have to consider how terrified I became. Fear does not only happen after you identify a threat. Sometimes the body reacts first. Something looks biologically wrong. Your brain does not recognize it. You feel immediate alarm. Then you start noticing every feature through that fear. Too tall. Too thin. Blood, bones, wolf head. By the time the creature turned and looked at me, my mind had already decided I was seeing something impossible. Those 5 or 6 seconds probably felt more detailed than they really were because I was staring so intensely. The fact that I rode away without taking another look preserved the image exactly as frightening as it first appeared. I never got the correction. That happens in a lot of unexplained encounters. You see something strange for a few seconds. You leave. Years later, you still have only the first interpretation. If I had stayed another 30 seconds, maybe it would have dropped onto four legs and clearly become a sick coyote. Maybe a person would have stepped out from behind it. Maybe I would have realized two animals were standing together. Or maybe I would have seen something even stranger. I do not know. And I am glad I did not stay just to satisfy curiosity. If it was a sick wild animal, getting closer would have been stupid. If it was an injured predator, even worse. If it was a person behaving strangely in the hills, I also had no reason to approach. Running was the right choice, even without the supernatural interpretation. I sometimes wonder why it did not chase me. At the time, that question fed the mystery. If this was some monstrous thing, why let me leave? Maybe it was not interested. Maybe it had already fed. Maybe it wanted me to see it. Those were the scary explanations. The simpler answer is that most wild animals do not want to chase a noisy dirt bike. The sound itself may have startled it. If it was injured, sick, or feeding, conserving energy would matter. It may have watched me only because I was a potential threat. From its perspective, perhaps I was the strange thing. A loud machine appeared on the trail. It turned, saw me. I left. End of encounter. That version is much less supernatural. It also explains the behavior better. A predator actively hunting me probably would have approached. Instead, the thing only looked. The association with the Wendigo came afterward. I think that distinction matters. I did not see a creature and somehow know its name. I saw something disturbing and searched for a known monster that resembled it. People do this naturally. Someone sees a large, dark animal walking upright and thinks Bigfoot. A strange winged shape becomes Mothman. An emaciated animal becomes a Wendigo. The label gives structure to something confusing, but a label can also influence the memory afterward. Once I started calling it a Wendigo, features associated with that idea may have become more important in my retelling. Tall, skeletal, animal head. It becomes easier to forget details that did not fit. That does not mean I made it up. It means memory and interpretation influence each other. My family's demon explanation may have done something similar. Once they said demon, the encounter gained moral meaning. It was not just a strange animal. It was a warning, something sent because of my behavior. I am much less comfortable with that interpretation now. There was nothing in the encounter that told me it was judging me. It did not speak. It did not point at me. It did not deliver a message. It did not attack. All it did was stand there, hear the dirt bike, turn, and look. The rest came from us. I also think age matters. Almost 14 is old enough to know animals reasonably well, but still young enough that fear can become enormous very quickly. I was riding alone. No adult was beside me to say that's probably a sick coyote. No friend was there to see the same thing from another angle. There was only me. That makes the experience harder to verify now. If someone else had been riding with me, their description would be incredibly useful. Maybe they would remember the exact same creature. Maybe they would laugh and say, that was clearly a deer, but no one else was there. So the story lives entirely inside my memory. That does not make it false. It just limits what I can prove. The smell is probably the strongest clue that something physical was nearby. I noticed it before I saw the figure. That means I was not simply frightened by the sight and then imagining a rotten smell afterward, unless my memory has rearranged the sequence. There was genuinely some source of decay in the area. Dead animal seems likely. If a carcass was near the lower trail, then a scavenger standing near it is an ordinary possibility. Maybe that is exactly what happened. A diseased coyote feeding on a dead animal. Its fur mostly gone. Its ribs visible. Blood on its head. It hears a motorcycle. and rises or turns awkwardly. From 150 feet away, a 13-year-old sees something that looks 8 feet tall and skeletal. That explanation is not perfect, but it is plausible. There may also have been more than one carcass or animal overlapping in my view. Imagine a coyote standing behind the ribcage of a dead deer. The living animal provides the head and legs. The carcass provides exposed ribs. Brown fur blends together. The background hides where one begins and the other ends. For 5 seconds, it looks like one impossible creature. Then it turns. I panic. I never learn the truth. That could account for some of the most impossible anatomy. The terrain could also have hidden the lower body. If the trail dipped, or there were bushes, what I thought was a narrow spinal column could simply have been a gap where the torso was obscured. Visual perception likes complete objects. If part of something is hidden, the brain fills in the missing shape. Usually that works. Sometimes it creates monsters. The wolf-like head may have been a coyote. Southern California has plenty of coyotes in areas near human neighborhoods. They are usually not enormous, but distance and posture could make one look bigger. A badly mangy coyote can look almost nothing like the healthy animal people expect. Long legs, thin body, patchy fur, large ears, narrow head. In some photographs, they already look creature-like. Add blood and poor viewing conditions, and I can imagine my reaction. There is also the possibility of a large dog. People abandon dogs. Dogs escape. Some breeds are much larger than coyotes. A starving dog with mange could look skeletal. If it had been fighting or feeding, blood could be present. Again, if it reared or stood on higher terrain, the apparent height could become exaggerated. I still cannot make the memory look fully normal in my mind. That is the frustrating part. Every rational explanation covers some details, but not all. A coyote explains the head and fur, not the height. A person explains the height, not the exposed-looking ribs. A carcass explains the bones and smell, not the movement. An overlap of several things explains more, but then requires a very specific angle. Still, real visual mistakes often happen because several ordinary conditions line up at once. That is exactly why they feel impossible. If there were one obvious cause, you would recognize it. The mystery comes from the combination. I also wish I remembered the lighting better. Was the sun behind it? Was it in shadow? What color was the trail? How much vegetation was around it? Those details could completely change what was visible. But what stayed in memory were the frightening features. The body, the head, the blood, the look. That is normal for an emotionally intense event. The brain stores threat. It does not necessarily store background scenery. After I told my parents and grandmother, their reaction probably strengthened the memory too. They believed me. That matters. If they had immediately said, "You probably saw a mangy coyote," I might have adopted that explanation and stopped thinking about it. Instead, the adults gave me an even more frightening possibility. Demon, now I had confirmation that what I saw might actually have been impossible. For a kid, that is powerful. And then I supplied my own label. Wendigo. Now the encounter had two supernatural explanations competing with each other. The possibility of an ordinary sick animal probably never had much of a chance in my mind at the time. I do not blame my younger self. If you see something that looks 8 or 9 feet tall, with what appears to be an exposed rib cage and a bloody wolf head, sick coyote is not necessarily the first thing you think. You leave. You can analyze it years later. That is what I do now. I also think it is important not to turn the location into proof. The fact that I was in Southern California does not make the sighting more supernatural. It actually makes me question the Wendigo interpretation more. The folklore I associated with that creature came from very different regions and traditions. I was borrowing a name because the image seemed to fit. That does not mean the thing belonged to that tradition. If I had grown up with different monster stories, I probably would have used a different label. Maybe skinwalker, maybe demon, maybe werewolf, maybe simply creature. The name tells you as much about the witness as the thing being witnessed. What I personally experienced did not have a name. It was just something standing on a trail. That is the version I trust most. I rode over a hill. I smelled something dead. I continued about 100 feet. I turned left. There was a tall figure or animal, roughly 150 feet away. It looked extremely thin and badly injured. Parts appeared furry. Parts appeared skeletal. Its head looked canine or wolf-like. There seemed to be blood. It heard my bike. It turned toward me. I stared for several seconds. Then I left. Everything beyond that is interpretation. That is still a frightening event. It does not need the supernatural. If I really encountered an animal in that condition, that alone is disturbing. A severely diseased predator can look horrific. If it was a person wearing or carrying animal remains, that is disturbing for completely different reasons. If it was two objects overlapping in a way my brain misread, then I experienced one of the most convincing visual illusions of my life. And if there was something about the encounter that none of those explanations covers, I am comfortable leaving that part unresolved. What I do not do anymore is say I definitely saw a Wendigo. I understand why 14-year-old me thought that. The image lined up with something monstrous I already knew. But there is no way for me to prove it. No photograph, no tracks I examined, no hair, no second witness. I never went back that day to search the area. I do not know whether there was a carcass where I smelled it. I do not know whether anyone else reported a strange animal. I only know what I remember. And honestly, I am glad the thing did not follow me. If it had been some injured animal, chasing a dirt bike may have been impossible. If it was frightened, it probably wanted me gone as much as I wanted to leave. Maybe when I disappeared over the hill, it returned to whatever it had been doing. Maybe there was a dead animal nearby, and it went back to feeding. Maybe that entire horrifying shape existed only because I caught it at the exact wrong angle. I hope so, because the alternative is the image that stayed with me afterward. Something tall enough that it did not seem like any normal person. Knees bent strangely inward, brown fur missing in patches, a rib cage that looked exposed to the air, a body so thin I could not understand how it was standing, a line down the middle that looked like a bare spine, and a bloody wolf-like head turning toward the sound of my bike. 5 or 6 seconds. That was all I gave it. Then I rode. I have wondered many times whether going back with an adult would have solved it. Maybe we would have found a carcass and coyote tracks. Maybe there would be nothing there. Maybe my parents would finally have seen what I was talking about. But I was not interested in answers badly enough to return. Whatever it was had already convinced me once to leave. I did not need a second encounter. Even now, the thing that bothers me most is not that my family thought it was a demon or that I once called it a Wendigo. It is the fact that before I saw it, I smelled death. Then I came over the hill and found something standing near the trail that looked to my 13-year-old eyes like it should not have been alive at all. When the dirt bike made enough noise for it to notice me, the entire body turned. And for 5 or 6 seconds, something with a bloody animal-looking head stared straight back at me. Then I made the best decision I could have made. I went home.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.